The fantasy football playoffs are right around the corner, and we have so many wide receivers out there playing with backup quarterbacks. There are truly very few wide receivers that you can just count on weekly without having to worry about it. It's that time of year where you really have to look at matchups and not take too much of a risk. The last thing you want to do is get cute in the last weeks of your fantasy football season and miss the playoffs because of it. That's why today we're talking about wide receivers to start and sit in week 14. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there today, where yes, we're talking about wide receivers. We should be starting here in week 14, and man, it's so difficult with bad quarterback play all over the league right now, just due to so many top-end quarterbacks being injured. We do have a few guys in today's video, though, that I think have a chance of filling in nicely for your fantasy football team, so be sure to stay tuned here throughout the show. But first, I want to give something away. Now, I'm going to be announcing the winner of the signed Jordan Addison football in my wide receiver rankings video, but this is Christmas time. I want to give more away, so let's do that. How about we give away in this video here a signed Brandon Aiyuk mini helmet. I got it from our friends over at Pristine Auction, and the giveaway, it's super simple to enter. All you have to do is hit the like button, leave a comment down below, and then be sure to have a free account signed up through pristineauction.com using the referral code Headliners. It costs you absolutely nothing. It is free to do. We don't make $1 from Pristine Auction. All we get in return is they send us items for us to then turn around and give them away to you. So if you want more items to give away, you got to go out there and get that free account signed up. But we're also running a separate giveaway up until Christmas. I don't know if you've heard about this one or not yet. I mentioned it earlier in the week. I actually may have mentioned it last week, maybe. We're giving away a signed Justin Herbert Funko Pop too. Look at that in the yellow ink. Okay, everything's backwards. In that yellow ink right there. This right here is sick. How do you get in on this one? It's a little bit different than the Aiyuk helmet. In order to get in on that giveaway, you need to send me email screenshots of the items that you're currently winning at Pristine Auction. It's the Christmas season. I want to see what you're buying out there for presents and how great of a deal you're getting them at. Now, I don't want to see your personal information. I just want to see a picture of the item and how much you got it for. Send me an email then at info@thefantasyheadliners.com, and then I'll randomly select the winner the week of Christmas and give away that signed Justin Herbert Funko. But I got one more thing before we get into all the matchups. If that's what you're looking for, there are timestamps down below, but I'm continuing my mission of trying to make the world a better place. So we got to talk about our Compassion Kid of the Week. Now, we're still sitting at 10 children sponsored here this year, but unfortunately, we've now gone 2 weeks with the same kids not being sponsored. We got to do something. We got to step up here during the holiday season. I am not going to be giving up on these kids, and I would like nothing more than to put a smile on their face here during the holiday season and take them out of extreme poverty. So once again, I'm going to mention one of them here in this show. I need some help from somebody in the community. Everyone say hello to Liz once again. She's 4 years old, currently lives in Bolivia, and has been waiting for a sponsor now for over 414 days. Is there anyone out there in Headliner Nation that is able to help Liz change her life? If there is, thank you so much. There is a link down below in the description, compassion.com/headliners. When you go to that website, you're going to see a group of children that are just looking for a chance at a better life. Now, maybe by the time you get to that site, you can't find Liz. There's still a group of other children looking for some help this holiday season. Those kids that you see on compassion.com/headliners are only available to our community. Their only chance they have at escaping extreme poverty is this community, so we got to step up and do our part. So like I said, if you're able to do that, thank you so very much, and thank you for giving me a minute here or two each and every week to talk about it. It is definitely something I'm very passionate about. All right, now let's talk some football. I know that's why y'all clicked on the video, and let's kick it off Thursday night football with a matchup between the New England Patriots and Pittsburgh Steelers. And that's right, it's the battle of Bailey Zappi and Mitchell Trubisky. Everyone's super pumped for Thursday night football this week. No, we're really not, because it's not going to be that exciting of a game. I may actually get a Thursday night off here this week. Let's be honest. Neither one of these quarterbacks are out there showing that they can make multiple fantasy wide receivers viable consistently, or at all for that matter. And not only that, everyone in New England is hurt right now. Juju is questionable with an ankle injury. Devontae Parker is questionable with a knee injury. Demario Douglas is still in the concussion protocol, and it's not like this was some high-performing, high-powered offense when everyone was healthy either. And now they get a matchup on the road in Pittsburgh. Not a horrible matchup. They allow the league average to opposing wide receivers. But let's not also forget that New England does not have Ramondre Stevenson, who's going to miss a few weeks as well. As of right now, I can't be overly interested in anyone in New England. Now, if he's fully healthy by the weekend, maybe Demario Douglas, but honestly, even his ceiling is super, super low, and I don't believe any of the wide receivers in New England are really worth the risk here in week 14. How about for Pittsburgh? I would love to believe in Mitchie Biscuits, how he could at least give, George Pickens and Deontay Johnson a decent floor. But they're just going to dink and dunk it down the field, and really, how is that much different than what Kenny Pickett does at quarterback? And I think we can all agree that for the most part this season, George Pickens and Deontay Johnson are just a letdown due to their quarterback play in this offense. There's going to be a lot of running the football, some good defense, the occasional pass to move the chains. Now they get a matchup going up against New England, which I guess isn't horrible on paper. They allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but we did just see them hold Justin Herbert and the Los Angeles Chargers in check. Now, I think I can honestly say I do love the potential of the Pittsburgh Steelers wide receivers way more than I do the New England wide receivers. Deontay Johnson may be the safer option of the two just due to volume. George Pickens a little bit more big play dependent, and we know there's not a whole lot of big plays in this offense. Both these wide receivers, though, aren't going to be ranked overly high, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of wide receiver 30 to 40. Which then takes us to Sunday football, a matchup with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Atlanta Falcons. Will kick it off in Tampa Bay because Mike Evans is just out there on a tear right now. The current wide receiver 5 overall, averaging 16 fantasy points per game, and has scored over 20 fantasy points now in 3 of the last 4 games played. In fact, he's on pace to have a better year with Baker Mayfield this year than any year with Tom Brady. The most receiving yards that Mike Evans had in a season with Brady was 1,124. He's only 112 yards from that right now at this time this season. The most touchdowns he ever had in a season with Tom Brady was 14. He's currently at 10. Do we think that he can get 112 yards and 4 touchdowns rest of season, which is still 5 games? He's got a pretty good chance, I would say. But now a matchup going up against Atlanta. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. These two teams faced off back in week 7, and Mike Evans had a casual 6 catches for 82 yards and a tutty. Plus, Atlanta's top defensive back right now, A.J. Terrell, currently in the concussion protocol, so that is definitely something to pay attention to. When it comes to injuries in Tampa Bay, it's most of the defense. For the most part, the offense is fairly healthy. With Chris Godwin really not being a factor, averaging under 9 fantasy points per game, really hard to trust Chris Godwin. He's only finished inside the top 24 wide receivers 17% of his games this season. It's still Mike Evans or no one in Tampa Bay here in week 14. But what about Drake London? This also may be one of those rare occurrences that we could use Drake London here this week. Yes, the matchup is that good due to all the injuries in Tampa Bay. Last week, kind of went as expected for Drake London. 1 catch for 8 yards and he was covered in sauce. But no other wide receivers in this offense are gaining targets each and every week. I believe that Drake London this week has a chance to see over 7 targets, which could put him right there in the range for 80 yards or so, right around 11 fantasy points. Not a great day, but not a horrible floor either if you need a starting wide receiver. In this matchup going up against Tampa Bay, they allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We're also watching an injury on the offensive line here in Atlanta. Offensive tackle Caleb McGarry suffered an MCL sprain and could miss some time. I would just love to trust Drake London, but this offense hasn't proven at all through 13 weeks of the season that not only can they be consistent, but that they can be highly productive as well. In my opinion, Drake London going to be a low-end wide receiver 2, maybe a high-end flex, hovering right around wide receiver 24 to 30. Which will then take us out to Baltimore for the Ravens and the Rams. And for the Rams, is it too much to damn ask just to have this team be fully healthy on offense one time this season? They finally had a game in week 13 where we saw both Puka and Cooper Kupp score over 12 fantasy points, but then word came out during the game that Puka suffered an AC joint sprain in his shoulder. Now, he missed some time in that game, but came back, and whenever he was on the field, he looked pretty damn good. Now, do not be surprised if he doesn't practice very much this week, but I do expect him on the field here once again in week 14. And we also know that both him and Cooper Kupp can coexist in this offense. Sure, They both may not score 20 plus fantasy points a game, but they can definitely go out there and get you 12 plus. It's just been one of those things where we can't keep these guys fully healthy. Now they get a matchup going against Baltimore on the road. In Baltimore, this isn't good because Baltimore allows the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We also know that Tyler Higbee, he suffered a neck stinger and is questionable to play this week as well. Matthew Stafford has been playing great here for the last few weeks though, but now on the road in Baltimore is not ideal. It's going to be hard for both of these guys to have one of those good games in a tough matchup like this. I see both of them as low-end wide receiver 2s, somewhere in the neighborhood of wide receiver 20 to 24 here this week for their opponents in Baltimore. Fresh off the bye week, and Lamar Jackson is healthy for a stretch run of the season. That's something we haven't had in years in fantasy football. I'm hoping that bye week gave Odell Beckham a chance to kind of heal up because his shoulder was hurting before the bye as well. And we need that because we've seen prior to the bye that both Zay Flowers and Odell Beckham have that big playability in this offense with no Mark Andrews who's still hurt. But just because they have that big playability doesn't mean we can pencil them in weekly. They're not weekly must-start guys. They need good matchups, and really, this matchup isn't great. However, it is, I guess you could say, a quote-unquote revenge game for Odell Beckham going up against the Los Angeles Rams, a team in which he won the Super Bowl with back in 2021. But the Rams allow the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And like I mentioned earlier, none of the wide receivers here in Baltimore can be considered safe by any means. But I can totally see Lamar Jackson trying to give Odell Beckham an opportunity at a few big plays deeper down the field to try to take it to his old team. And he also wasn't really a fan of the Zay Flowers touchdown celebration just a couple weeks ago. Neither one of these guys are going to be ranked overly high. However, I do expect Odell Beckham to slightly outscore Zay Flowers here this week. Which takes us out to Chicago for the Bears and the Lions, and a couple of no-brainers here in this matchup. Amon-Ra may be one of the easiest set-it-and-forget-it type wide receivers in fantasy football. He's the current wide receiver 8 overall, averaging 16.5 fantasy points per game, and hasn't scored under 11 fantasy points in a game this season, which is absolutely bonkers. He's finished as a top 24 wide receiver in 91% of his games this season, and no other wide receivers in Detroit get enough volume to where we're scared about the target share of Amon-Ra. Now he gets a matchup going up against Chicago, a team in which he just faced a couple weeks ago. They're right around the league average when it comes to opposing fantasy points per game allowed to wide receivers. But in that meeting just a couple of weeks ago, Amon-Ra had his typical 11 targets, 8 receptions, 77 yards, and a touchdown. Now nothing else has really changed in Detroit since they met last time. Don't overthink it. He's an absolute must-start is Amon-Ra. As for DJ Moore, he's not as safe as Amon-Ra, but he's damn near must-start as well. He's had at least 16 fantasy points in each of the 2 games he's played in since the return of Justin Fields. He's the current wide receiver 10 overall, averaging 14 fantasy points per game. Now, if you play in full PPR scoring, you probably like DJ Moore even more because of all the receptions he's racking up in the short passing game. They're just trying like hell to get him the ball in his hands to see if he can make something big happen. Remember, one of the greatest attributes that DJ Moore has is his yak ability. Yards after the catch. He's a master at it. That's why they're just trying to force feed him the ball. Now a matchup going up against Detroit. It's a pretty good one. They allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. In their meeting a couple weeks ago, DJ Moore had 7 catches for 96 yards and a tutty. Another team that doesn't look too different than when they faced off just a couple weeks ago, but they are fresh off the bye week, which means more than likely they had an extra week to figure out ways to force feed the ball to DJ Moore, and he should definitely be started in all formats once again. Which will take us out to Cincinnati for the Bengals and the Colts. And before we get going here in Indianapolis, let me start off by saying this to Josh Downs. Thanks for absolutely nothing. Back-to-back matchups in where you could have absolutely dominated. You had 18 targets over the last 2 games. You got the opportunity I was expecting. And then you turned it into 8 catches for 57 damn yards and didn't help anyone. An absolute total bomb and a missed call by me. My bad, to the bench he goes. Unlike Michael Pittman, though, this dude, he's been inside my top 12 for weeks, and he's going to continue to stay inside my top 12. He has 7 straight games now in double digits, over 100 yards receiving in back-to-back ball games, and 3 straight games with at least 12 targets. And now he gets a matchup going up against Cincinnati, who allows the 13th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We talked about this last week. Could the Jonathan Taylor injury lead to more passing volume in Indianapolis? And really, it looks like that could be the case, and we will take it. But there is another name to watch here in Indianapolis. It's Alec Pierce. Now, last week he had 3 catches for 100 yards and a touchdown. That dude is out there doing what I had expected Josh Downs to do. Now, if they continue to look the way of Alec Pierce here over the next week or so, he's definitely a name that we could stash end of season. But he really hasn't done much here in 2023 up until last week, so I'm not going to rush to start him in fantasy football. Right now, it's Michael Pittman or nobody inside my top 30 rankings when it comes to Indianapolis Colts wide receivers. All right, how about Cincinnati? And can we all get a collective hell yeah for Jake Browning? Dude is an absolute baller and has proven that he can handle this offense just fine. Now, I'm not going to get overly excited. That Jags pass defense was pretty bad, but the kid still looked great. Plus, he keeps Jamar Chase as a high-end fantasy option, and we all absolutely love that. Now, we also saw the return of T. Higgins last week. Didn't do a whole lot, but with the return of T, that could push Tyler Boyd to the waiver wire once again. Because I think it's obvious when we look at this offense in Cincinnati, Jamar Chase is option 1, 2, and 3, and then it's Joe Mixon, and then it's a mixture of all the young tight ends, and then it's everyone else. Jamar gets to eat, and then everyone else gets the scraps. Now they get a matchup going up against Indianapolis, and when it comes to opposing wide receivers, they're right around the league average. Jamar Chase is going to remain an auto must-start as of right now. Higgins and Boyd at best are maybe top 25 options, but in reality, I don't think that we can feed 3 wide receivers in this offense if we're going to continue to throw the ball to Joe Mixon and the tight ends as much as we are. So really, it's Jamar Chase inside the top 12, everyone else probably outside the top 30. Which will then take us out to Cleveland for the Browns and the Jags and what is going to happen in this Jacksonville offense here in the near future. They have to keep winning ball games. They don't have a choice, and they just lost Christian Kirk and Trevor Lawrence potentially. Now, after the injury to Christian Kirk, a lot of people, myself included, thought this was going to be a huge opportunity for Calvin Ridley to carry people to fantasy gold here in 2023. But that ain't going to happen if the quarterback is CJ Beathard. Now, they have come out and said that Trevor Lawrence suffered a high ankle sprain, but as of right now, he has not been ruled out here for week 14. Do I see him playing? Probably not. And if he can't play, how can we trust any of these wide receivers with any type of confidence? It's not that CJ Beathard is just a bad quarterback, but we have no idea who he's going to lock onto in this matchup. Plus, it's not an easy matchup. Going up against Cleveland, they allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and this game is on the road in Cleveland. Now, Christian Kirk, we already know he's done for the fantasy season, but a lot of people have an obsession all of a sudden with Parker Washington. And I'm not going to take anything away from the kid. He had a solid game in week 13. But we're talking about an offense that still has Calvin Ridley, Zay Jones, Evan Ingram, Travis Etienne, and potentially a backup quarterback. It was a great story in week 13, but Parker Washington is not somebody he's not somebody we're thinking about starting here in week 14. Now, once Beathard came into the game, he only threw the ball 2 times to Calvin Ridley. One was a deep ball that was called back due to penalty. The other one resulted in -4 yards. He was way more focused on Evan Ingram and Zay Jones. With so much unknown in this offense and really the unknown to Trevor Lawrence, I don't know if any of the Jags wide receivers are going to make it inside my top 30 rankings. As of right now, if I had to pick one, it's still Calvin Ridley, but barely. But what about in Cleveland? Because after what we saw Jake Browning do against this defense last week, we should feel really good about firing up Amari Cooper, but as of right now, he's still in the concussion protocol, so we don't even know if he's going to clear it in time to play in this ball game, which means Elijah Moore could be an option for us here this week. Now, he led the team in targets in week 13 with 12 of them. Didn't do a whole lot with it, only caught 4 passes for 83 yards, led all wide receivers in yardage there as well, but we know Joe Flacco wants to throw the football. It's kind of what he does. Plus, we know it's way easier to throw on Jacksonville than it is to run on Jacksonville. They allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But what do we do if Amari Cooper is good to go for this matchup? Honestly, this could be one of those cases where both of these guys are still fantasy viable options for us this week. We saw Joe Flacco come back and play in his first game last week, and he threw the ball 44 times. They're going to have to throw it once again here this week. If Amari Cooper is active, he's inside my top 24, and Elijah Moore is verge top 30. If Cooper is out, though, Elijah Moore is going to be the guy that we see inside my top 30 rankings this week. Which will now take us out to New Orleans for the Saints and the Carolina Panthers. And for Carolina, we got new coaches, but the same sucky team. They have now managed to alienate their best wide receiver on the roster. The first 10 games of the season, Adam Thielen had 7 games with 9+ targets. Over his last 2 games combined, he has a total of 9 targets, 4 receptions, and only 27 receiving yards. The dude was the wide receiver 11 overall through the first 10 weeks of the season and now has completely disappeared. But where has all the volume gone? If Thielen isn't getting it, who is? Well, the last 2 weeks has been Jonathan Mingo. He's been their leading receiver these last 2 games, but hasn't even scored over 10 fantasy points in either one of them. This offense is just unbearable and impossible to trust. Bryce has no time in the pocket, and he just isn't the playmaker that CJ Stroud is. Now they get a matchup going up against New Orleans. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. When these two teams faced off in week 2, Adam Thielen had 7 catches for 54 yards and a touchdown. And I still have no idea why they went away from him. He should be seeing consistent targets each and every week. But now we get inconsistent volume, a road game, and a difficult matchup. It's going to be hard for me to get any Carolina wide receiver inside my top 30 here this week. Some front offices are just bad. Carolina is one of them. But what about in New Orleans? The biggest question mark here is who the heck is the quarterback going to be? Can Derek Carr overcome yet another shoulder injury and clear concussion protocol? Or do we see Jameis Winston get the start? Either way, there's really only 3 people in this offense that get consistent volume. It's Taysom Hill, it's Alvin Kamara, and it's Chris Olave. Olave has now had back-to-back games with over 100 yards receiving. It's the first time he's done that this season. Now, most of that's due to Michael Thomas being on IR, and Rashid Shaheed's missed the last couple games due to an injury. But now they get a matchup going up against Carolina, and it's not going to be easy. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and back in week 2 when these two teams faced off, Chris Olave had 11 targets, 6 receptions, and 86 yards to lead all wide receivers there in New Orleans. It's still unclear whether or not we're going to get Rashid Shaheed back this week because he's still technically questionable to play. But with the limited pass-catching weapons here in New Orleans, it is impossible to not keep Chris Olave inside the top 24 wide receivers weekly. Given the matchup and the unknowns at the quarterback position, I'm looking at Chris Olave as being a top 15 option here this week, not somebody who we can really count on up inside the top 10. Which will then take us to a matchup between the New York Jets and Houston Texans. And for Houston, damn, it sucks to no longer have Tank Dell for the rest of the season. Stupid play calls, though, have stupid consequences. Why is the smallest guy on the roster in the middle of a goal line push? That makes no damn sense. But now, all of a sudden, once again, we need Noah Brown to step up. We already know that Nico Collins, he's a damn stud. He just had a season high in targets, receptions, and receiving yards in week 13. He's now the overall wide receiver 11 and averaging 15 fantasy points per game. Most importantly, though, the touchdowns, they've started showing up. He's now had a touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games he's played. In the other 9 weeks of the season, he'd only had 3 total touchdowns, so they're definitely starting to come more consistently now here towards the end of the season. But now they get an absolutely horrible matchup going up against the Jets. They allow the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and you have to think that Nico's going to be across the field from Sauce Gardner. Only 2 times all year long has Sauce allowed over 50 yards receiving. Kind of crazy, both instances were against Gabe Davis. Which is kind of weird, but maybe those bigger-bodied wide receivers have a better chance at those 50-50 balls against Sauce. We also know that Dalton Schultz, he's still questionable to play, but the good news is last week Noah Brown played in 81% of the snaps, so he should be fairly healthy enough here in week 14. He is a very risky play with huge upside. We've already seen that this season. He is not some locked and loaded absolute must-start guy, but if you're looking for a high-risk, high-reward play, that could be Noah Brown. As for Nico Collins, he's going to remain a top 20 wide receiver. But if you look at your overall matchup or you fall behind early, Noah Brown may be the guy that pops off here in week 14. But what about on the other side of the football for the Jets? What a damn mess in New York here as of late. You bench Zach Wilson because he sucks. Then you start Tim Boyle, who also sucks. You then bench Tim Boyle and go with Trevor Siemian. Then you release Tim Boyle, and now you contemplate going back to Zach Wilson. Zach Wilson doesn't want to start again. Nope, reports are Zach Wilson would start again. What are we doing here in New York? Luckily, it doesn't really change the status of Garrett Wilson regardless of who plays quarterback. We've been dealing with bad quarterback play in New York all season long. Regardless of who plays quarterback, Garrett Wilson's still going to go out there each and every week, get right around 10 targets a game, and hover right around wide receiver 25 to 30 each week. This week, probably not much different going up against Houston. They allow the 13th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but they are easier to throw on than they are to run on. Let's just keep it simple stupid here, okay? Let's rank Garrett Wilson right around wide receiver 30 so our expectations aren't super high, but we recognize that he has a fairly safe and consistent floor. Which will then take us out to Las Vegas for the Raiders and the Minnesota Vikings, and it's finally time. The long-awaited return of Justin Jefferson to our fantasy football lineup. So many people pumped up for this. Now, when Jefferson is active and healthy, we already know we start him 100% of the time, especially since these are must-win games for the Minnesota Vikings right now. But what does this mean going forward for Jordan Addison? Can Josh Dobbs supply both of these guys? Honestly, I have my concerns. All season long, Dobbs hasn't really been a guy to support two fantasy viable wide receivers, especially in this case when they have TJ Hawkinson on the roster. But Las Vegas isn't some pushover defense. They're a lot easier to run on than they are to throw on as well. But with Minnesota coming out of the bye week in these must-win games, I really look at TJ Hawkinson as being the number 2 receiving option in this offense after Justin Jefferson. Addison is just going to become very, very big play dependent, and if he doesn't score a touchdown, more than likely he's going to end up hurting your fantasy football team. I already said that Justin Jefferson's a must-start. He'll be inside the top 12. As for Jordan Addison, maybe on the verge of being outside the top 30 here this week. But what about in Las Vegas? You have to think that coming out of the bye week at home in Vegas, that Davante Adams isn't going to want to be shown up by another wide receiver on the opposite side of the football. The problem is, Adams hasn't really been able to have one of those big games in a long time. Only one touchdown since week 3 and only one 100-yard receiving game all year long. He's the current wide receiver 19 overall, averaging 11.7 fantasy points per game. But here's what really sucks. He's scored in the single digits in 6 of the last 8 games he's played this year, and that is not helping anyone. Even his teammate, Jakobi Meyers, is only 10 points behind him overall on the season. You would have thought I was absolutely crazy had I sat here before the season started and said, hey, listen, going into week 14 of the season, Jakobi Meyers is only going to be 10 points behind Davante Adams. But yet, here we are. And now they get a matchup going up against Minnesota. They allow the 11th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Coming out of the bye week, Las Vegas fairly healthy, and this is really going to come down to the play of Aiden O'Connell. And really, it's his inability to find the end zone that's the biggest problem. The volume, it's going to be spread around. And with the touchdowns few and far between, Davante Adams just isn't some locked and loaded top 10 guy every single week. Going into a matchup like this, Davante Adams is going to be right around wide receiver 15 or so for me in my rankings, where Jakobi Meyers probably on the verge of making the top 30. Which then takes us down to San Francisco for the 49ers and the Seattle Seahawks, and damn, I wish we could see that dominant version of DK Metcalf more often. The dude gave 0 Fs in week 13, 6 catches, 134 yards, 3 touchdowns, and passed Tyreek Hill as the fastest ball carrier of the year. When DK is on and Geno can get him the football, no one can stop him. I just don't understand why it doesn't happen more consistently. This was only DK's second 100-yard receiving game of the season and his first since week 3. But which DK Metcalf shows up this week? Going up against San Francisco, they allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. In their matchup just a couple weeks ago, DK only had 3 catches for 32 yards. But now we know this run game in Seattle is absolutely banged up. Both Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet questionable to play here in week 14. We also have the emergence of JSN, Jackson Smith-Njigba, who seems to be getting more and more volume each and every week. He actually led the team in targets last week with 11. At this point, Tyler Lockett, more of a third wheel than anything else. So when you look at this wide receiver trio, JSN is going to have the safest floor due to the volume. DK, he's going to be my highest ranked guy with the highest upside inside the top 20. But then in San Francisco, you have to say it with me. We've said it every single week, and we're not going to stop now. When all the weapons in San Francisco are fully healthy, we start them because they all have matchup winning upside. So you better believe that both Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk are going to be inside my top 15 once again this week like they were last week. In fact, what's kind of crazy, last week's overall wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 was DK Metcalf and Deebo Samuel. This offense in San Francisco is just too good. They score so many touchdowns, you can't afford to sit any of these guys, especially in a good matchup like this one. Seattle allows the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and both Deebo and Ayuk scored over 12 fantasy points in their meeting just a couple weeks ago. There's no major injuries right now in San Francisco. It's a home game. It's a great matchup. Yeah, this is an easy start for me for both guys in San Francisco. Which will then take us down to Kansas City for the Chiefs and the Bills. And for Buffalo, we already know that we always start Stefon Diggs. He is a weekly must-start guy. The current wide receiver, 7 overall, averaging 15.5 fantasy points per game. So what about this matchup? Is it a good one for Stefon Diggs, or should we be a little bit worried? Well, we know when these two teams come together, all logic goes out the window, and usually because of that, we see a whole lot of offense. I don't know about you, but a whole lot of offense is kind of what we look for here in fantasy football. So honestly, I don't hate the matchup this week for Stefon Diggs, but is there anyone else in Buffalo that we can rely upon, like Gabe Davis or maybe Khalil Shakir? I mean, it wasn't long ago that Gabe Davis put up a 200-yard game against the Kansas City Chiefs in the playoffs. But that dude is so damn boom or bust, and he has multiple games here over the last month of the season where he's had 0 receiving yards. And it's not like this Kansas City defense is some pushover. They're a little bit better than league average here. They're playing well in 2023. We're also getting close to a Dawson Knox return. Not that that's some big, huge addition to the offense, but somebody who could get a couple targets that takes away from somewhere else. So with so many unknowns in this offense after Stefon Diggs, I don't know if I can really trust anyone else. Khalil Shakir only has 1 fantasy viable day over the last month of the season, but we also know the ceiling of Gabe Davis is much higher. And in a potential matchup where we're going to need some high-scoring offense, I think I smell another Gabe Davis touchdown. But what about Kansas City? It finally happened. For the first time all year long, Rashee Rice has seen 9+ targets in back-to-back ball games. They're finally catching on in Kansas City that they need to find a way to get that kid the ball more often. He is the only wide receiver we consider in Kansas City. I said that like a week or 2 ago. I'm not even talking about anyone. No one else is worth the time of talking about them. Rashee Rice is basically the only guy that can catch the ball and do something with it after the ball is in his hands. And like I said, I'm expecting some offense in this game, and they're going to have to throw the ball in Kansas City if they want to have a chance to win this ball game, and they need to start winning again in Kansas City. They've lost 3 of their last 5 ball games. That is not normal for Patrick Mahomes. But now going up against Buffalo, they allow the 11th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but we do know they're also dealing with a lot of injuries there on the defensive side of the football. I really hope they continue to give this type of volume to Rashee Rice, though, but they really utilize so many pass catchers in this offense. It doesn't give me that warm fuzzy on the inside, but with the offense we're going to need in this ball game, I kind of view Rashee Rice as more of a top 24 play here in week 14. Which will then take us all the way back out to LA for the Chargers and the Denver Broncos and Courtland Sutton. Can we all just speak this into existence here real quick? All of us, everybody hold hands, everybody, here we go. We need Courtland Sutton to see 10+ targets in week 14. If he gets that, he's going to be a top 10 wide receiver on the week. Yes, the matchup is that good, and so is Courtland Sutton. Whenever they decide to throw him the damn football, he's the current wide receiver 21 overall, averaging 11.4 fantasy points per game, and has touchdowns in 9 out of 12 games this season. 75% of his games played in 2023, he scored a touchdown. That is absolutely ridiculous. Now, this should also be a chance for the likes of Jerry Jeudy as well, but how can we trust a wide receiver who through 14 weeks of the season is averaging less than 7 fantasy points per game game and hasn't even had one finish inside the top 24 at the position all year long. The floor is just too low, and all the touchdown upside goes the way of Courtland Sutton. But this matchup is so good against the Los Angeles Chargers. They allow the third most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Between the matchup, the fact that this game is indoors, love the touchdown upside still, and the potential need for it here in this game, right? We've seen LA kind of struggle on offense just due to the lack of weapons, but they do play a little bit better at home, which means Denver should have to score some points. When my rankings come out, Courtland Sutton's going to be up inside my top 15, but if he can get those targets, dude's going to finish top 10. Just too hard to trust anyone else in Denver. All right, how about for LA? And help is on the way. It may not be this week, maybe next week. We really do not know for sure, but the Chargers have activated Josh Palmer's 21-day practice window, and we have to wait to find out exactly what that means. When is he going to return? I'm still doubtful that it's going to be here this week. If I had to guess, maybe next week, but I'm no doctor, right? Aside from that, though, I think we already know that we always start Keenan Allen here in fantasy football, a must-start guy. The current wide receiver 3 overall, averaging almost 18 fantasy points per game, and he's only 218 yards and 5 catches away from setting career highs. The guy's having an amazing year. Now a matchup going up against Denver on paper doesn't look great because they allow the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But with Keenan Allen spending so much time in the slot, it really helps him to avoid those top cornerbacks like a Patrick Surtain. Plus, it's a home game, a must-win game for the Chargers, and there's no way we're trusting Quentin Johnston because the dude just can't catch the football. Until we get Josh Palmer back at 100%, it's only Keenan Allen in LA. Which will then take us out to Dallas for the Cowboys and the Philadelphia Eagles, my Manscaped matchup of the week. I could sit here and tell you all about the products and how you'll like them, but come on, let's be honest. The biggest thing here is let me give you a discount. Christmas is right around the corner and you need to buy Christmas presents. And I'm sure you've noticed by now, everything is freaking expensive. Take that 20% discount from Manscaped.com. Go do a little bit of Christmas shopping. Get it for a little bit cheaper. I promise I won't tell anybody that you got it at a discount. Then once you get it, wrap it up, throw it under the Christmas tree, and be ready for a lot of Christmas morning laughs. Once again, head over to Manscaped.com, get 20% off your order and free shipping using the referral code HEADLINERS at checkout. There's links down below in the description. And look at all the green on the screen. Here is a matchup between two of the best offenses in the NFL with multiple big play threats all over the field. Two weekly must-start guys in A.J. Brown and CeeDee Lamb, another top 15 to 20 wide receiver in Devontae Smith, and a dude with touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 ball games in Brandon Cooks. We got 2 teams fighting for the division. Only 1 game separates them. Philly won their last matchup a few weeks back, but both of these teams are pretty hard to run on, so they're going to have to throw the ball, which is great that this game is being played indoors and we don't have to worry about any bad weather. Really, the biggest question in this ball game for me is, does Dallas go dare? Right now I'm feeling freaking fancy in my Manscaped matchup. Does he return this week? Because if he does, that does limit the upside of Devontae Smith. And while I do think that's somewhat of a big concern here this week, Philadelphia is going to have to keep their foot on the gas to beat the Dallas Cowboys in week 14. The ceiling may be higher for the wide receivers in Dallas just due to the matchup alone, but I don't see how you could sit any of the top 4 guys in this matchup here this week. Which then takes us to Monday Night Football, the first of 2 games. Yes, 2 games on Monday. The first one, the Tennessee Titans and the Miami Dolphins. For Tennessee, I'm not going to lie, I'm not really liking DeAndre Hopkins very much here this week. He's only finished as a top 24 wide receiver in 1/3 of his games this season. With the passing offense here in Tennessee, the touchdown chances are just few and far between, and the volume that he does see isn't always quality. Then you take into account that he's got to face Jalen Ramsey this week, and the amount of risk explodes in your face. Plus, this overall defense in Miami is pretty freaking good. They're top 10 in the NFL in multiple main defensive categories. The potential saving grace here is that Miami gets an early lead, and Tennessee has to try to throw the ball all 4 quarters to play catch-up, but DeAndre Hopkins is going to need a big play and a touchdown to be fantasy startable. He'll be in my top 30, but towards the back half of my top 30. How about Miami? We already know what to do here. Tyreek Hill is locked in every single week, and yes, so is Jalen Waddle. I know the ceiling for Jalen Waddle isn't as high as so many people had wanted, myself included, but as a low-end wide receiver 2 or a flex play, I don't see how we could sit him in this matchup. If I get to this point of the season and I get cute and bench Jalen Waddle, he goes off on my bench and I miss out on the playoffs because of it, I would be so mad. Plus, this game is being played at home, and the Miami Dolphins are so much better at home. Tua doesn't have a game this season at home in which he hasn't thrown for at least 2 touchdowns in those games. And now a matchup going up against Tennessee, who allows the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. I am not overthinking this one. Both these guys locked into my lineup. Which will then take us to the last game of the week. We got the Green Bay Packers, the New York Giants, and for Green Bay, Jordan Love right now is just balling out, and his wide receivers are benefiting from it. But we also know that we may have just lost Christian Watson. Yes, once again, he's hurt with a hamstring injury. But now that means that the likes of Romeo Doubs and Jayden Reed become higher-end fantasy options right now. Albeit by higher end, I'm meaning low-end wide receiver 2 flex options for us here in Week 14. I still believe that Jayden Reed will be the better wide receiver going forward rest of season, but in a matchup like this, I don't know how we can overlook the touchdown upside of Romeo Doubs. They have a matchup going up against the Giants, and they allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. With Christian Watson more than likely out, Aaron Jones still questionable, Luke Musgrave out on IR, we have opportunities here for Jayden Reed and Romeo Doubs to both have decent fantasy days in Week 14. I haven't forgotten about Dontavian Wicks. He just does not see consistent enough volume to really warrant a start yet here in fantasy football. But I'm really not opposed to playing either Jayden Reed or Romeo Doubs in my flex here this week. Both those guys going to be on the verge of making my top 30 wide receivers. But what about in New York? And sorry, not sorry. No one in New York is going to make my top 30 rankings at the wide receiver position. Now, I will come out here and admit that Tommy DeVito is better than what I expected him to be, but this is one of the worst overall passing offenses in the NFL and the 2nd lowest scoring team in the league. I hope they continue to throw the ball down the field to Jalen Hyatt because I do believe he is the best wide receiver on this team when given the opportunity, but Green Bay is pretty solid against the pass. They're much easier to run on. Sorry, I'm just not really interested in guys that can't even sniff double-digit fantasy points for months on end. But all right, that's going to do it for my wide receiver start and sit video here for Week 14 of fantasy football. Hopefully you gained enough information to have a good idea of how you're going to set your lineup here in Week 14. If you still have a couple questions, don't worry. Our rankings videos will be out Thursday morning prior to Thursday night's game so you can make all those final lineup decisions. I'm going to get out of here for the day, though. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend. And then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.